record to the cloud. All right. So some housekeeping items before I introduce this session and our panelists. First of all, as you all just noted, this session will be recorded. I'm going to ask everyone other than the panelists to mute themselves throughout this session. And I'm going to ask that if you have questions throughout the presentation, if you could please type them in the chat. There will be some opportunities throughout the presentation, and at the end, I'll be taking questions from the chat to pose to our panelists. So Breakout Session 1.5, Achieving Diversity in Labor Arbitrator Selection, is what we're here to discuss today. The lack of diversity in labor arbitration is a long-standing and well-known issue. An example of that lack of diversity can be found when we look at the membership of the National Academy of Arbitrators, which I do note is not inclusive of all the labor arbitrator community. The most current statistics I have on the NAA membership is that 27% of the membership are women and 3% are persons of color. Today's discussion will focus on efforts the RCI is making as it seeks to increase diversity in labor arbitrator selection. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists for today. First, I'll introduce Michael Gann. Michael has practiced labor and employment law for over 30 years and is a managing partner at Peer, Gann & Gisler in Washington, D.C. Michael has represented labor unions and employees in court arbitration and before most federal agencies with jurisdiction over the workplace. He is general counsel to the 130,000 member National Rural Letter Carriers Association and maintains a significant practice representing clergy in employment contract negotiations with their religious institutions. Michael also teaches labor and employment law at American University's Washington College of Law. Prior to joining Peer, Gann & Gisler, Michael worked as an attorney in the appellate court branch of the National Labor Relations Board's Division of Enforcement Litigation, where he briefed and argued cases in most of the U.S. Courts of Appeals. Michael is a graduate of the University of Michigan and Boston University School of Law. He's a member of the AFL-CIO's Union Lawyers Alliance and a board member of the Ray Corollary Initiative. Michael, can you just wave and say hello so people can see you in your box?
Hi, everybody.
Thank you. Here. Next, I'm going to be introducing Andrea Ganson. Andrea is the Vice President of Labor Relations for Amtrak, the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which serves more than 300 passenger trains a day, more than 300 passenger trains a day, over 21,000 route miles to more than 500 destinations, with responsibility for the administration of 21 collective bargaining agreements, covering more than 15,000 employees represented by 12 different labor organizations. Part of her scope of work is for the execution of arbitration as prescribed by the Railway Labor Act and the respective collective bargaining agreements. Prior to working for Amtrak, Andrea worked for Allegiant Airlines, Union Pacific Railroad, and Pacific Corps in labor relations and human resource roles. She's a graduate of Creighton University and received her law degree from the University of Iowa. And Andrea is also a board member of the Ray Corollary Initiative. Andrea, can you wave and say hello?
I certainly can. Hello, everybody.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Professor Homer LaRue, who teaches law and has done so at the Howard University School of Law in Washington, D.C. for 28 years. He's also an arbitrator and mediator of workplace disputes for more than 35 years. Homer co-authored the article, The Ray Corollary Initiative, How to Achieve Diversity and Inclusion in Arbitrator Selection, the inspiration for his founding of the nonprofit RCI Inc., for which he serves as the chair of the board of directors. Homer is also the current president of the National Academy of Arbitrators. And Homer, if you could take yourself off mute, I'm going to, and say hello, I'm going to now turn it over to you, and I'll be sharing my screen. Homer?
Yes.
All right.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sarah. If we could go to the first slide, please. I want to start my remarks. The way we have organized this, I'm going to make some remarks about the RCI from the perspective of the corporation and what I was intending and Alan and I intended in our article. And then my colleagues, who are also members of the RCI Corporation, as Sarah has indicated, will talk about the RCI from the perspective of labor and management and what their expectations are. Next slide, please. I want to emphasize, next slide, please. We'll leave this up. That Sarah mentioned that I am also the current president of the National Academy of Arbitrators, but I want to emphasize that the matters that we're going to be addressing here today, including the slides, are my views and those of the Corollary Initiative. I am not here to speak on behalf of the National Academy of Arbitrators in this presentation, although we will mention the National Academy's role during the course of the presentation. This is the roadmap for us this morning. I'm going to talk about the origins of the Corollary Initiative, the current stage and mission of the initiative, why the pledge is important and what it does, and the elements of the pledge. Next slide, please. A brief history now. Next slide, please. As Sarah indicated, the Corollary Initiative grows out of an article published in the Howard Law Journal in 2019, authored by myself and my colleague, Alan Symonette, also a member of the RCI board and a member of the National Academy of Arbitrators. So let me start, for some of you, and I apologize, much of what I'm going to be saying here, I presented at our recent conference of the National Academy of Arbitrators in Toronto. And so if you were there, I apologize that this may be repetitious. But let me start with talking about where the name originated, RCI. RCI comes from I named it after Charlotte Ray, who was the first Black woman to graduate from Howard Law School and the first Black woman to be admitted to a bar in the United States. She was admitted to the bar of the District of Columbia. And I thought it was appropriate that this initiative be named after her. So that's the origins of the name. Next slide, please. Since I've mentioned the Academy, I also should mention that the role of the Academy has been one of supporting the concept of the RCI and encouraging its development. I want to emphasize, however, that the National Academy of Arbitrators is a separate and distinct organization from the Corollary Initiative, which is a standalone nonprofit to carry out the mission of the Corollary. The evolution of the RCI from a concept into a nonprofit corporation dedicated to move diversity in arbitration selection from aspiration to a plan of action is one that has been supported by the Academy, and I want to acknowledge the Academy's assistance with regard to that. If you want to know more about where we are and what we're doing, you'll note here at the bottom is the Corollary Initiative website. And I invite you to visit the website to keep current on what we're doing. Next slide, please. Let me now talk about the current stage and the mission of the initiative. Next slide, please. The mission of the RCI is to increase diversity, to increase equity and inclusion in the selection of arbitrators, mediators, and other ADR neutrals. And it's going to do this by encouraging a commitment by the ADR community to the RCI pledge, and otherwise the RCI Inc. will provide research and tools to support the selection of diverse neutrals. That's the mission of the RCI. Next slide, please. Why the pledge and what does it do? I think there are 5 reasons that I want to identify for us today. And those 5 reasons for the pledge are based upon social science empirical research that has been done recently. Next slide, please. First, the 30% metric in the final slate for selection has been demonstrated by social science empirical data to dramatically increase the chance of selection of a diverse candidate. So part of the mission of the RCI and the pledge is to have the ADR community, both the rostering community and those who select arbitrators, to come to the table or to do their selection from a slate that is 30% diverse. It does not dictate the standards upon which an arbitrator or mediator will be selected. It simply says that the pool from which, or the slate from which they will be selected will be diverse. And meeting this 30% metric has been shown in other contexts to have the effect of expanding and promoting diverse persons in positions of importance. Next slide, please. The third reason, or why the pledge, is that efforts to increase diversity in the legal profession have been augmented by the ABA House of Delegates Resolution 105. And the RCI intends to augment Resolution 105. For those of you who are not readily familiar with that resolution, 105 aims to increase diversity in the broader dispute resolution community. And this follows from the ABA's commitment to increase the overall diversity in the legal profession. 2 initiatives that the ABA has been working tirelessly on for the last, I would say, 10 years. So and the 5th reason for the pledge is that increasing the diversity in dispute resolution best serves justice when neutrals reflect the broader society. That's the fundamental principle, if you will, that the RCI is based on. Next slide, please. Now, what does it do? What does the pledge do? Or a person taking the pledge, or an organization taking the pledge? It promises that to select must be accompanied by an accountability that is, if there's to be real success. And success means collecting data on the work that's being done to increase diversity and sharing of that data. I think one of the reasons why the many well-meaning attempts to diversify the arbitration and mediation process or selection hasn't worked as well as we would like is that we're operating in silos instead of a collaborative method of dealing with the issue in which we collect data and share it with one another so that we can share the successes and the challenges that we faced so that the next organization doesn't have to face the same challenges. That's part of the problem. So the RCI is intended to promote the collection of data, the collection and the sharing of that data. Next slide, please. And the importance of documenting efforts of the parties in promoting the selection of diverse neutrals is essential. There are benefits to the parties and to their clientele, because as you'll hear from my colleagues after I finish the initial presentation, the ADR community needs to understand and really take seriously that this is something that our clients are asking us to pay attention to. It benefits the credibility of the dispute resolution process. Unless this process better reflects the persons on whom the decisions are being made or facilitating the decisions, I think that we have an existential threat to the legitimacy of the ADR process, both arbitration and mediation. That's why this should be an important goal for all of us involved and who care about the ADR process. Next slide, please. The pledge and its role. Next slide, please. The pledge is designed for the unique needs of law firms and party representatives, of arbitral institutions and rostering agencies that are not parties or party representatives, and of arbitration users who are neither party representatives, arbitral institutions, nor rostering agencies. Now, you'll notice that there are three pledges. They're essentially the same, although they have been designed so that the entity signing onto the pledge represents what that entity, where that entity is in the ADR process. And I'm happy to announce that as of today, the pledges are on the website, and I encourage you to go to the website, review the pledges, and make a determination as to whether you and or your organization are able to sign on to one or more of the pledges. Next slide, please. So to encourage the parties and their representatives to set as a goal to include at least 30% diverse neutrals as candidates on any list, 3 or more on that list, from which the neutrals for a given matter are ultimately selected. This is the essential element for the RCI, what we are attempting to do. Next slide, please. And what I haven't done yet, what this slide shows, is what's the definition of diversity? Diverse neutrals are defined consistently with ABA Resolution 105, and they are persons who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, AAPI, other people of color, women, persons of differing sexual orientations, gender identities, and persons living with disabilities. So essentially, the RCI attempts to continue the work begun by Resolution 105, strengthen it, give it a metric so that we can really begin to measure our success in increasing the diversity. Next slide, please. So what we're seeking to do is to encourage parties and their representatives, one, to collect data. Obviously, this is after, once the pledge is signed, to collect the data on the diverse neutrals proposed and or appointed in their matters. Because remember, as the old saying goes, if we're not measuring it, it's not real. And so the collection of data is an essential part of taking on the pledge. Next slide, please. I'm going to stop here and allow my colleagues then to make their comments with regard to the RCI. And then we, as Sarah will lead us through the questions, and we'll have more of a roundtable discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Homer. Michael, could you share with us the labor perspective on this?
Sure. And you'll see on the screen now the pledge that the rural letter carriers took. This is the union that I have represented for almost 30 years. And I think it's important to just set the stage a little bit. The NRLCA is an independent union, not affiliated with the AFL-CIO, represents about 130,000 Postal Service employees who deliver the mail in rural parts of the country, but increasingly over the last 20 years in suburban parts of the country. Its makeup is also unique. 55.6% of the bargaining unit is female, and 44.4% is male. And it is the other way around with the other 3 major postal unions. So we have a majority female bargaining unit. When I first started representing the union almost 30 years ago, all of the union representatives holding the highest positions in the union were male. That is no longer the case, not even close. It's probably also flipped. And the folks who adjust grievances on the union side at the step of the grievance process right before arbitration are all female. We have seen over the years an increasing, as I mentioned, suburbanization of the union, which also has led to increasing racial diversity at the NRLCA. And these, this issue, I think, has been important to the union as it has grown over time. And as general counsel, it has been an issue for me to continually raise with my client. But I think there are sort of equal parts lawyer here, equal parts client here, and together taking the pledge, which the NRLCA did back in December of 2021, was a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer from a social justice perspective, especially in the times in which we live now. But I also think, and Homer alluded to this, there's a credibility, frankly, issue that the union, the folks that it represents, has with the community of arbitrators who are serving it. There has to be a relationship between the group of arbitrators that we see on a regular basis and the makeup of our bargaining unit. And I think increasingly that has become more and more and more important. And as Homer said, we hear it from our members, and therefore paying attention to diversity has been something that we have really worked on. And I think from my perspective, and I think this is true for most labor lawyers on both sides, we are the folks who generally are selecting the arbitrators. We get our client's blessing, but we are the ones who are making the recommendations and selecting arbitrators. It has been my practice since I became general counsel to make sure every list that we propose is diverse. I think we've been meeting the 30% metric, sort of unknowingly and without, counting for a very, very long time. I think the lists that we proffer these days exceed the 30% metric by at least 20%, I would guess. And now that we have taken the pledge, there will be accountability, and we will, of course, keep very good track of this. I think that the labor commitment at large is also something that we can count on. The RCI's work has been a focus of the AFL-CIO's Union Lawyers Alliance, which is a group of lawyers, obviously, that represent organized labor. And I think there is significant momentum among the labor side of the bar to ensure that both clients and other lawyers and general counsels are aware of the initiative, are taking the pledge, working with their brothers and sisters on the management side to have them do the same. And I was recently at the National Academy meeting talking about postal labor arbitration, and had the bully pulpit and used it to talk a little bit about the RCI, and made a friendly challenge to my co-panelists to join us in taking this pledge. I think what we will continue to see is certainly as the initiative becomes sort of better known, an increasing number of labor unions and general counsels and other lawyers commit to this really important work. And Sarah, I can say a little bit more about it, but maybe I'll pass it off to Andrea now, if that's what you'd like me to do.
Certainly. Andrea? Oh, you're on mute, Andrea.
There we go. So if you would change to the next slide, I think that's where mine is. Our our relationship with our unionized employees at Amtrak is governed by the Railway Labor Act. And that's an esoteric little weird niche of labor law. But the Railway Labor Act was created with the overall goal of making sure that there was labor peace and that the railroads continue to operate. And because of that, we have a different arbitration mechanism than you'd find under the National Labor Relations Act or any other sort of arbitration agreements that you might find in business. And that is that our arbitration is federally funded. So with the fact that our tax dollars pay for arbitration in the railroads, it means that basically every case goes to arbitration. We easily arbitrate over 100 cases a year. And while the percentage of women in unionized positions with Amtrak is about 17%, our minority percentage is almost 50%. But historically, our arbitrator pool hasn't reflected the diversity of that employee population. Traditionally, railroad arbitrators came from either the upper management of the railroad, which was predominantly white and male, or the upper management of the unions, which likewise was predominantly white and male. And so being progressive about this and knowing that, I mean, if you want to talk about financial reasons to do this as a business, it matters to me that there is credibility in the arbitration system, which is an employee's potentially last shot to save their job. And it stands as the step in between, you know, that major decision that was made about their employment and them going and seeking redress in other ways, hiring an attorney, trying to get the arbitration decision overturned, or trying to find a different avenue that leads to greater legal costs for a company. And so in a really practical sense, we want employees who go through arbitration to feel like this is credible, that the person that is deciding this case may come from a similar place, a similar mind frame, a similar community that they do. And, you know, with unconscious bias, recognizing the impact that has, you know, the diversity of the arbitrator totally implicates fairness. And that is, or the perception of fairness. And, you know, as a result of that, you know, doing the RCI pledge was a very easy thing for Amtrak to do. We had to negotiate with our unions about that. All of our boards are governed by an agreement. And so this is a sample of the language that we put in. And it is, we have an additional hurdle of the fact that the National Mediation Board, who would pull our arbitration list together if we had to ask them for a panel, doesn't track diversity of the panel. So at this point, we are making conscious efforts when we select, you know, different arbitrators about who we put on a strike list, about making sure that we have representation for that. But this is going to be something that we will be pressing forward with the National Mediation Board to help assist us in making sure that there's credibility to this process. I think there's a path forward with that. It's not clear how quickly or through what channels we can get it resolved, but, you know, I think the more pressure there is to move in this direction, the easier it will be.
Thank you. And Andrea, did you share with us how many of your unions have taken this pledge with Amtrak, or of the unions who negotiate with Amtrak?
Over half of them have. Over half of our arbitration agreements have this in there. Some of our unions have tried to use our desire to do this as a lever to ask for other concessions in other agreements, which is not to be unexpected, but I think that we have absolute momentum getting there. And even for those unions that weren't ready to sign on to this. They understand the principle behind it and they're supportive of the principle. They just want to see what else they can get out of it.
Thank you. All right, now is the time for the audience to be able to pose some questions to our panelists. So please, if you've got questions, type them in the chat and I'll be happy to pose them to the panelists. And I guess I'll just throw it out there for all of the panelists. Do we know of any other organizations, employers and unions who have incorporated the pledge so far?
I can speak to that if I started off anyway. Again, those of you who may have been at the National Academy meeting in Toronto in May know this. In addition to Andrea being invited to talk about the employer's perspective as she did today, along with her counterpart, who unfortunately could not attend because of an upper respiratory problem on the day of the presentation. But the other two parties that were present to talk about their commitment and why they took the pledge and incorporated the RCI was the city of Philadelphia and its FOP. In a recent interest arbitration, Alan Symonette served as the interest arbitrator, and the parties raised with him while he was in that role their desire to have a more diverse panel of arbitrators for termination cases. They negotiated. One party wanted it to be 50%, the other party wanted it to be 30%. They agreed on a diverse panel of 40%. So and they both spoke quite extensively at our conference about why it was important for them, for both the employer and the union, to effectuate this agreement, to make it real. It was important for the legitimacy of the arbitration process. It was important for the police department in terms of its relationship with the community of persons whom the police protect. So that's at least one other entity. There are others that have not completed their negotiations yet, and therefore I'm not really at liberty to talk about those. But Michael and Andrea may know of others.
You know, I don't, but I wanted to mention just one thing about how just to sort of fill you in about how the union approached this and how I, as counsel, raised it with the executive board of the union. This was an issue that was put on the agenda of our December 2021 board meeting. I gave all of the board members a copy of Homer and Alan Symonette's wonderful law journal article in the Howard Law Review, a sample pledge, some other reading material, and we met. And as many of you might imagine, in a union board meeting, you can fight for hours about one word in a collective bargaining agreement, or what position we should take on this issue or that. And it was so gratifying to me that this issue was so important to the 9-member executive board that they didn't really want to discuss it. They wanted to raise their hands and unanimously pass a resolution to adopt the pledge. It was that simple, and the statements from the board members were emphatic. I think this is how it will be replicated at other unions in that process. And the reason I think I want to be on this board is to use kind of an organizing model to bring this to the attention of my colleagues, both on the union sidebar and the management sidebar, and help them see this through. So I think we're just beginning, but I think there's lots more to come, and it will come soon.
Thank you. Andrea, is there anything you wanted to add on that before we go to the next question?
No, just to, again, emphasize that the unions were in favor of it. But they had some other things that they wanted to get done also. Our organizations that I deal with aren't organized the way that the ones Michael deals with, and so it's not as easy to bring forth a conclusion because generally there's one person making the decisions. And if the decision is that they want to get something else out of it, that is the direction it goes. However, I think that over time, we will get there with all of our organizations.
Thank you. So we do have a question, and I'm going to encourage everyone to continue typing questions into the chat. What has been the FMCS and AAA response to the RCI pledge?
Let me go back to something that Andrea said to start this off. Like the mediation board, the FMCS does not keep demographic data. And both organizations have indicated to us that there are impediments in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, that prevents them from doing so. They've also indicated that those impediments are not insurmountable. And as Andrea indicated, they're beginning to work on that. Neither FMCS nor AAA has officially taken the pledge as a rostering agency, but we are in discussion, the RCI that is in discussion with both of them, and we're working toward that goal.
Thank you. So I will just, I'll pose another question. And audience, please do type in the chat. My question is, if people here are here who might want to take the pledge on behalf of their organizations or speak to their clients about the pledge, what resources does the RCI offer?
Well, again, speaking as the chair of the board, one thing, as I indicated during my remarks, there is a website. The pledges are on the website, and you are certainly free, and all of the board members are certainly ready, willing, and able to talk to anyone interested about the pledge and what it means. We are also very much involved in developing the RCI. I should be a little bit more candid about just how nascent the corporation is. It was formed in October of this year. And so that's how new the not-for-profit. So those of you who are, I'll just make a brazen plea. Those of you who have a burning desire to get rid of some money, we are willing to take donations, even though we do not have our nonprofit status yet. That's just how new we are. We are a 9-member board. We do not have an executive director at this point. And so we are still very much trying to carry out the mission of the RCI, and at the same time, build the infrastructure so that we can build out the mission. Obviously, those of you who have been involved in building movements or building organizations know just how challenging some of these things can be. But the board and I are fully committed to carrying out the mission and bringing these things about. But again, if you have a desire to take the pledge and to donate money, we are quite willing to make that happen.
All right. And so I'm gonna pose another question, and remember, audience, type in the chat. If you could take out your crystal ball and tell us how much progress has the RCI made 10 years from now? I'm going to start with, and so which panelists would like to begin with your predictions?
I'll start.
Thank you, Michael.
You know, the Postal Service is really a unique employer. I would venture to guess that there is no other employer and group of unions that use arbitration services more than the U.S. Postal Service. And Sarah and Homer, you may be able to either confirm or deny that, but I think it's true. I mean, the numbers are massive. Not as much from the union that I represent. I think our arbitration program is a little bit different than the other three major unions, but the number of cases is extraordinary. There have been backlogs in the tens of thousands in previous contract years. My prediction is that we will see this, that all of the unions and the Postal Service will take the pledge. It's not going to take 10 years if I have anything to do about it, and that we will see the exchange of lists, which is how most of us do it. We don't typically go through any of the rostering agencies. They're there as a fail-safe, but the parties tend to exchange lists. And I think we will see increasingly diverse lists, and frankly, we will see increasingly diverse panels. And I think that it is just a matter of time. I think it becomes very difficult. I think this will have a lot of momentum, and I think it'll become very difficult for one side or the other, a union or an employer, to say, no, we're not interested in increasing the diversity on the lists that we exchange. I can't imagine that. I mean, Andrea suggested that maybe the union in one of the unions, or several of the unions in her cases, are trying to get something in exchange for that. But I think as a matter of sort of basic, DEI consciousness, it's an almost untenable position to take, and no matter what side you're on.
Thank you, Michael. Andrea, you want to get out your crystal ball 10 years from now?
I wish it was more untenable than it seems to be with some of my folks. But, I think generally everything that Michael says is true. There is just, it's such a no-brainer as far as where we need to go for the credibility of the process, and also with the dynamics and the demographics of the people who are going to make up the workforce of arbitrators and mediators. So, I think, to me, what the RCI is saying is that we don't want to wait. We want to start. We don't want to wait for this natural progression of people who are getting the opportunity to do this kind of work to finally get used, and to open up and expand the diversity of the panels. We want to be putting pressure on the movement so that it moves faster. And in 10 years, I would really hope that it is just a foregone conclusion that this is how it's done.
Thank you. Homer?
I'm going to I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to do it a little bit backward. RCI is still in place in 10 years, and it occupies the position that Diversity Lab occupies for the Mansfield rule. For those of you who are not fully aware, the Diversity Lab launched in 2017 an initiative called the Mansfield Rule. It was aimed at, and still is aimed at, increasing diversity in big law. Now, in its fourth year, there are some upwards of 200 law firms that have or are in the process of becoming Mansfield certified. What that means is that they've used the 30% metric as a measure of diversity success with regard to hiring, retention, placing people on pitch lists. Pitch committees are those who go out and pitch the law firm to a potential client. What Diversity Lab has been able to do is offer the structural mechanism to assist those firms in becoming certified, assist them in talking about the collection of data. Diversity Lab offers the firms a safe place to place that data so that it can be then made anonymous and shared with others who are seeking that same kind of certification. So to answer your question, Sarah, I see in 10 years, RCI being in a position not looking to necessarily explain what the pledge is, but that's fully known, but that we are fully able to support those firms and organizations in carrying out the mission of the pledge in much the same way that Diversity Lab has been successful in doing it in big law. And I think what Andrea and Michael have said is so very important, that there's an immediacy to this, because what is truly at stake is the reputation of arbitration and mediation. If it doesn't reflect the diversity of the communities that it serves, it will soon fall into disrepute. And those of us in this room are all participants in the ADR community, and that's the last thing we want to see. We know how useful these processes can be. And so it's up to us to ensure that they go forward and are successful in the future.
Thank you. I have some audience questions for both Michael and Andrea. So Michael, I've got a number of questions, so I'm going to go through them. What changes, if any, have been the result of the rural letter carriers taking the pledge? Have you and the U.S. Postal Service added any people of color to your arbitrator panel since then? And what is the total number of arbitrators on your panel currently and the number of people of color?
So since we took the pledge, we've negotiated a new collective bargaining agreement with the Postal Service, and the contract that we work under requires that we reestablish panels within 6 months after negotiating a new agreement. So we're in the process right now of reconstituting our panels. As you can imagine, every time we do this, some people are not invited back and others are, and so we have vacancies to fill. We have about 20 arbitrators on our various panels. That's it's a fraction of what the APWU and the NALC and the mail handlers have on their panels. As far as racial diversity on the panel right now, I think we have one person of color. We have over 50% female, or right around 50% female. And as far as the lists that we are in the process of preparing and have prepared in prior rounds, as I said, I think as long as I have been involved, our lists have been, at least 30%, and they will continue to be that or greater. Clearly, we want to increase the racial diversity on our panels. We have gender diversity, but that's kind of a rough sense of what we have, and the work is clearly not finished, and we will be working on this for the next several months until our panels are back.
Thank you, Michael. And there's actually a follow-up question. A audience member wants to know, is it true that the rural letter carriers and its counterparts only select National Academy of arbitrators? And if so, would the percentage of National Academy of Arbitrators, persons of color arbitrators being around 3%, do you see this as a hindrance if that is your practice?
Good question. The other 3 unions I know do not look to the National Academy as a sort of first priority. Our union has historically selected its panelists from the National Academy. That has changed over the last probably 2 to 3 contract cycles, and we have increasingly incorporated non-academy arbitrators onto our panels. I think, my predecessor viewed the academy as the litmus test for the best arbitrators in the land, and that's what we wanted to deliver for our clients. I see how that could be problematic as far as racial diversity when the academy is made up of so few, arbitrators of color. That said, it is not a problem for me to put together a panel of diverse arbitrators, even if I'm selecting from academy members.
Thank you. And Andrea, we have a question from the audience as to what progress has been made on the list that have been put together with the unions and Amtrak who have taken the pledge in terms of diversity on the lists.
We have gone from having entirely undiverse panels in their entirety to now having, we have 4 panels that currently have women on them, and then a panel that has minority person on it, and we continue to work through it. We generally keep the same arbitrators for that board, which is what we call them, because they hear several cases at a time. And so it's when we're replacing somebody off of a board that we go to the selection process. So from the time that we've had this in place, which has been less than a year, we have made some progress, not as much as we need to.
Thank you. All right, and remember, audience members, if you've got questions, put them into the chat. We have a few more minutes, and so I am going to ask a question about the scope of the RCI. Certainly,
Sarah?
Yes. So Gary, can you type your question in the chat? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to pose this question quickly. We know that we're here today to discuss labor arbitrator selection, but can you tell us about the scope of the RCI? Does this extend beyond the labor arbitrator community?
The short answer, Sarah, is yes, it does. We're here talking about labor management and employment because that's the nature of the meeting and the organization of people. But the RCI intends to reach commercial and international as well, because we see the same problem existing in both of those areas of ADR.
All right, thank you. And Gary, I see a question, mutual agreement for selection of arbitrators. Maybe you can take yourself off mute and just ask your question, because I want to be sure the panelists are understanding it.
Yeah, and it's kind of a long question, or if you will. It's a, and I'll address it first to Michael. I'm assuming with the rural carriers and postal service, they have to jointly agree on an arbitrator. How does the RCI, I don't know if the postal service has agreed with RCI, but how does the union and the postal service monitor, if you will, RCI pledge when because you're based, as I understand, you're going to be selecting from those who have submitted to become an arbitrator for your union. But if you don't get mutual agreement on, for example, arbitrators, and the percentage drops below the RCI goal, how does the rural carriers handle that? And the question can go to all the panelists.
Sure.
But I just,
Okay,
Yeah, let me just say this.
thank you, Gary.
Thank you for the question. The rural carriers do not select arbitrators based on submissions from interested neutrals. People are free to share their resumes, and we consider those, but our lists are put together regardless of what we get coming in terms of interest. So it's very easy for us to control what our lists look like, and that we have complete accountability for, because as general counsel, I keep those lists, and I know from contract to contract who we've put on the list, and I can easily do the same kind of monitoring on who we get from the Postal Service on that list. The Postal Service has not formally taken the pledge. It's a work in progress, and now that two of the largest unions recently reached negotiated settlements, it's time to have those conversations in earnest. But I think that we will be able to do that, at least on our side. It's centralized. All of the selection is done through my office and through the Director of Labor Relations. Many of the other unions are selecting out in the field, lots of different locals, lots of different panels, really easy for us to control. I think that frankly will be the challenge for the other unions. But this is as Homer said, we only started this in October of last year. We're not even a year into it yet. So I think lots of good things to come, but I think that accountability can easily be accomplished, Gary.
And if I could add one other point to Michael's, and that is that part of what we wanted, the reason we started RCI Inc. in the first place, is to be able to lend assistance to the parties in ways that we can't even anticipate today. But what we hope is that the RCI will become resourced sufficiently to be able to add training, add opportunities for the parties to understand better how to collect and share data, how to make the process much more transparent. And so that's part of what I was saying earlier about the goal of the RCI. We are trying to think through and get to that point of assistance to the parties.
Thank you. And that is the perfect ending point for our session. And so as a reminder, if you want more information about the RCI, you can go to the Rate Corollary Initiative website. And as Homer said, from there, you'll be able to see the pledges, you'll be able to get more information, you'll be able to also contact the RCI board. And as Homer has said, if you want to make a donation, I'm sure that there's a way to do that by contacting the RCI, and they'll give you some instructions. So I want to thank you all, and I want to thank our panelists for this session today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.